Hello and welcome to another edition of The Stench of Truth. It is with great sadness that I come on here today to talk about the tragedy in Sandy Hook, Newtown, Connecticut, and the terrible loss of life up there. And of course this does involve the gun issue, and I've talked about this several times in the past, and unfortunately I have to do so again. But before I begin, I would like to send my condolences to the families of all the victims, and the blessings of my spirit to the victims themselves, that they move on to greater things beyond this horrid world that we continuously live in. Now, before I actually get into an analysis of this, I want to make sure that you understand that I'm not going to be talking about the specific instances in this case because I have not looked at all of it. So it's not going to be a breakdown of why this particular killer did this particular act at that particular place. Instead, what I'm going to do is look at the broader picture of what we may be experiencing here in this country. And make no mistake about it, this is terrorism. It's terrorism against the people of the United States. And the question is, who are the perpetrators here? Who are the ones that are instigating the terror, and for what purpose? And that's what we're going to discuss here right now. So anybody who has ideas about various conspiracies that might be involved and why this guy engaged in the activity that he did, and the mother, and all of these other things, okay, we're just going to leave that be for now. Okay, and if you want to leave a comment about it, that's fine. But just remember that this is not where I'm coming from right now. I'm going to look at the wider picture here and try to make some sense of this, and maybe give people things to talk about so that we can engage in a conversation that might be able to resolve some of this, or at least give a framework for future events, and trying to take away from this knowledge and ideas about how we can prevent the deaths of people in the future. Okay? Now, there is no way that anybody can ever deny that the United States has a culture of violence, and it has always had a culture of violence. And the suffusing of the country with guns did not happen simply by chance. Do you suppose that the vast amount of guns that are owned by the citizens of the United States is there simply by virtue of a chance happenstance that this would come to be? There are more guns in this country than there are probably in most nations' armies around the world. I don't know if that's true, but it feels about right to me, because there are, what, 100 million guns in this country? 300 million people? How many countries' armies need 100 million guns? You know, of course they're going to have machine guns and things like this as well, but just think about that. I'll bet there are many countries around the world whose entire military establishment does not have as many guns as are owned by private citizens in this country. Okay, we live in a culture of violence. This culture of violence is fostered in many ways. It's fostered by video games that promote and reward the most violent people. But there are also more insidious ways that this is promoted. And I think the most egregious and outrageous example that we can see today is the end result and the end product of the finance capital system that we have in this country, where the most psychopathic, least compassionate people are rewarded for their behavior of cutting jobs, throwing people out of their homes, and bringing in the biggest profits for the corporations at the expense of the people who work for them, who impact them. And of course this is translated in other ways as well, away from the consumer side. Okay, and we can look at this from the issue of the psychotropic drug industry, which of course is part of the pharmaceutical industrial complex in this country. And whether or not you're on psychotropics is largely irrelevant today, because the water supplies in many places around the country are suffused with these drugs that get into that water system, whether or not we want it to be there or whether or not it's planned that way. They're there, okay? And people are being dosed with them whether they realize it or not. One of the things that you will hear more talk about is how antibiotics that have penetrated into the groundwater have led to vast resistance to antibiotics by bacteria. And that's why we have these very aggressive staph infections where people have to lose a limb, and the only way they can treat them is to cut off parts of the body in advance of the spreading infection. Otherwise, there's no way to treat them. And of course, if our water supply is suffused with pharmaceutical drugs, and they include psychotropic drugs, then it's natural to assume that one might develop some sort of problems in relation to that. Okay. What is happening in this country is an act of terrorism, and it's only a question of who exactly is behind the terrorism. And I would assert that the same people who are behind the financial terrorism that we are undergoing in this country and are the victims of are the same people who are ultimately behind this act of terrorism against the people of this country. And it has been systematic. Now, if you look at the history of where we have been and where we are now, you will see that there has been several things that have gone on which have promoted this ideology. The culture of violence, the culture of medication. One thing that you can look at that is very clear and very well supported is the notion that we have been at continuous war for years and years and years. And there are young people right now who have been born and have grown up in a society that has been at war for their entire lives. Okay, where there are declared wars, there are also many instances where we are bombing people with remote piloted drones. And there is absolutely no difference in the minds of some between a drone jockey in Las Vegas who takes his Predator drone, fires a Hellfire missile to take out a quote-unquote terrorist in some country that most people don't even know where to find it on a map, and people who play Grand Theft Auto or any of these other video games. But I'm not asserting it's the video games. I'm just saying the video games are a symptom of the sickness of the culture itself, because it rewards and makes people feel better about themselves, and you get more ranks and more levels the more you kill, destroy, and maim. Most of these first-person shooter games are not the cause of the problem. They're a symptom of what's wrong with our culture. And all you have to do is look at statistics for violence, and you will see very clearly that death rates by handguns in the United States surpass anything anywhere around the entire world. Not only that, but if you look a little bit deeper, you'll also find that the deaths by assault in general, which would include all forms of physical damage, the United States leads everybody else, every other country around the world. And it would be perhaps instructive to try to look for similar geographical areas and population densities and things of this nature to get an exact comparison. But when it comes right down to it, the United States is the most violent country in the world, sometimes an order of magnitude larger than the closest possible other country that would come nearest to us. There is no question that guns make it easier to kill people because you do not have to be as close. Sure, You can use a baseball bat, you can use a knife, you can use any number of other instruments to kill people, but guns make it easier to kill people. Now, the gun lobby in this country, I would assert, is largely dominated by the same kind of institutional investors which control the corporate conglomerates that we see now, which control and move our economy forward. They're the ones that own just about everything. So if you were to look, for instance, at the ownership of the stock of Smith & Wesson or Ruger or any of these other companies, I'm sure that the very large institutional investors like hedge funds and others are heavily invested in this because it's a great way for them to make money. And how do you make money off of guns? Well, most people who have a gun or two don't want or need any more. But there has been this mentality that forces people to think about buying more and more guns and stocking up on more and more ammunition because this is being promoted by a certain, sector of this society. When you look at the people who push this, the people like Alex Jones, who are very, very right-wing, very controlled by Council for National Policy, John Birch Society types. These are people who instill in you a fear against your government, like your government is going to come and do something. And all you'll hear from Alex Jones in relation to any of these horrible gun-related tragedies is that Obama or the government is going to come and get your guns. And this is not going to happen because the forces at work here operate behind the government. They're the ones that supply all the military hardware to the government to enable them to conduct their mass murder overseas. And the only way that you can have this type of activity happen in this country is by the continuous selling of this. And the only way that you can have the continuous selling of guns to people is to continuously engage in active terrorism against the people themselves in order to spur more sales. Now, if you look at handguns around the world, we are by far the largest purchaser of them, and in a lot of instances probably the only purchasers of them, because in many countries you simply cannot get handguns. So when we look at the idea that we are constantly engaged in a war against the nebulous terrorists and constant war in Afghanistan, Iraq, and in countless other places around the world where we send in remotely piloted drones to use missiles and bombs to kill supposed enemies of this state, we are suffused in violence and blood and death on such an ongoing basis that people cannot even grasp it. Now, this is the sad reality of this situation, people, that the only way that they can have a massive effect on the people is to kill children. Because killing 10 or 15 adults or 20 or 30 adults in a mass shooting is not going to affect people as much as it would have done 20, 30 years ago. Now, certainly there would be a certain amount of people who would be deeply horrified by that action, but the only way that they can get the kind of response that they need out of the populace in this country is to continuously up the ante, Now, I'm not suggesting that you're going to see, more and more murders of larger and larger groups of children, because that also would not be effective. But these things have to progress in stages. It's almost like being addicted to something. You have to get to a point where you need more of the substance in order to feel the same effects that you would have in the past. And this is the same thing here. Our culture is so immune to the death that it sees around it, to the blood gushing in the streets, to the murder and mayhem that is caused by our military around the world, that these types of things have to be ratcheted up in order to get the same effect. And what is the effect on society? Well, we're finally seeing people who are talking about gun control, and gun control is far different than people coming, bashing your door in and making you give over your guns. Okay? It's a personal decision as far as I'm concerned whether or not you decide to have weapons and whether or not you decide to do anything with them. Of course, you have to face the consequences for your actions. And unfortunately, there is a lot to be said for how gun laws in this country are enforced and what people can do about the enforcing of the gun laws in order to have some kind of positive effect on society. So when you look at the totality of what we see in this country, we see that violence begets violence, and it's simple as that. As long as we have a government that fosters this violent tendency in the people by promoting and exporting the culture of violence overseas by murder and death and things that we call police actions, wars, whatever you want to call them, war on terror, whatever kind of euphemism they want to use, all it is death, hand-delivered death. And until we decide that we want to end that culture of violence, these types of things are going to continue. But there are other things that are going on as well. There is also the idea of the end of the world, the apocalypse that is coming. Most of this can be traced back to fundamentalist evangelical Christianity, which promotes the idea of a coming apocalypse. And you have to realize that there is an entire cadre of people that are involved in this movement that want that to happen because they view that as a preceding event to the coming of Jesus the second time. So they want the apocalypse. They're waiting for it to happen. They're hoping that it occurs. A lot of these people, like Seventh-day Adventists and others, are into this doomsday lifestyle. And this is where some of the prepping thing came from, the doomsday preppers, that apparently the mother was in this particular case, or at least getting started in that path. I don't know what religion they followed there either. That may have played a factor, and that's what I say. I do not know the details in this case enough to comment on it in that fashion. But I'm going to look at it from this perspective. The idea of prepping for doomsday comes from the religious side. It comes from the right wing. It comes from also the idea of apocalypse in general. Now, I think that a lot of the religious people who would be promoting doomsday ideology when it comes to the apocalypse and the return of Jesus and all this other kind of stuff have latched on to the idea of 2012 as well. And if you'll remember, last year we had 2 predictions of the end of the world made by Harold Camping that failed to come true. And we see this happening from time to time within the far-right evangelical community. And if we have another culture supposedly predicting the end of the world, this has led probably to some of these Christian groups pushing forward their timelines and their ideology of looking forward to the coming apocalypse so that they can rejoice when Jesus finally returns. And never mind the fact that massive numbers of people would be killed in such a horrific event, and the blood running in the streets would be very horrific. We don't need to worry about that because Jesus is coming back and He's going to make everything great. So, what do we have? Video games as a symptom of a sick society, a culture that is on the verge of collapse. We also have the idea of this coming economic apocalypse, which is tied into all of this. We also have the stress of everyday life and a very bleak future that is constantly hammered into our heads. What people need to realize is the news media is a purveyor of death and blood. And you know the old saying, if it bleeds, it leads. So whatever is the most bloodthirsty story is on the mainstream news, but you also have the mainstreaming of the alternative media community as well, which tends to also sensationalize these types of things. And of course, we have had the promotion of 2012 doomsday. We've had the promotion of apocalyptic scenarios. And we also have a promotion of the idea that the government is evil in some way, and they're going to come and get you. Yes, we do have a burgeoning police state in here, but it has nothing to do with the government. It has nothing to do with the government any more than the government has anything to do with what wars are carried out or anything else anymore in this country. Because what we have instead is we have the corporate oligarchy deciding what needs to be done. And they tell the government what to do. They tell the military what to do, and that's what they do because they're the ones that actually run the society. So, but we also we have the alternative media that is constantly hyping on this mantra of the government somehow being the enemy, and people feel powerless against that. And they feel the need sometimes to have weapons and to protect themselves from the evil, nefarious government. But the government is not the evil one here, people. It's what I've always been telling you for I don't even know how long. It's the corporations and banks, finance capital have always been the ones behind this. Now, when you look at statistics for violence as well, you can find that most gun violence happens in the South. Most assaults in the United States happen in the South. Now, I've had at least one person accuse me of having something against people from the South, and nothing could be further from the truth. I've been to the South. I've met many people from the South, and they are wonderful, caring people. The problem that you have in the South is the mentality of the people who run the South, and that is the neoconfederates. They do not believe that they lost the war, or they want to keep fighting the war against the federal government. That's why you have so-called right-to-work legislation down there, which people have been led to believe means that you get more jobs, but in actuality, all it means is you get less pay for the jobs that you do. And that's just the fact. And busting up unions is a way to help corporations. It does nothing to improve your lot in life, but that's what you're led to believe. So you have in the South a continuation of the Confederate mindset by the people who run everything down there. There was no redistribution of land. There was no breaking up of the plantations. There was no taking away of the power of the people who ran the Confederacy, so that they can continue to purvey their exact same ideology down to today. And a lot of the power in the South is in the hands of these people, the descendants, whether it is by direct familial descent or by investment down through the years, of the same kind of Confederate mindset people that were overlording plantations that had slaves on them. And the end result is that they want slaves. They want mindless drone slaves. They also want less of them. So putting deadly weapons into the hands of the public is something that is on their agenda, because ultimately people are going to take out the targets that are closest to them or the most spectacular, rather than trying to do something about the overlords that are lording over them. Just look at the fact that most of the right wing, and this is also the actual nest from which a lot of the right wing John Birch Society type stuff comes from. It comes from the South. It comes from the neo-Confederate mindset. And I'm not talking about the people who live there, because they're just as much being used as anybody else. The corporate structure in the South is different than it is in the North. And I think the overall plan by the far right, by the neo-Confederates, is to make the North like the South. And that's why you see right-to-work legislation being passed in some of these northern states that were formerly strongholds for unions, like in Michigan. So, ultimately, what does it mean? There are also other things that are going on as well. We are seeing the disintegration of society in general. We're seeing the financial collapse. We're seeing huge amounts of stress being placed on people's lives. And we also see the drugging of the population, whether or not they want to be drugged. We also see demonization of this as well from some of these people on the far right, who I presume would have even the most crazy people be not on pharmaceuticals. I find it hard to try and stick up for the fact that some drugs actually do work and help people. And I would say that that's an entirely individual experience, and it's up to everybody to make their own decisions based on the best evidence that they have, whether or not they want to be on any kind of psychotropic medication to help with, whether it be depression, psychosis, whatever it is you might have. But the fact of the matter is that the pharmaceutical companies in this country are part of the massive corporate oligarchy that runs this country, and that's why you can't negotiate with them to get lower prices, and you can't escape from their clutches, because a lot of this stuff ends up in the groundwater and you end up consuming it anyway, and you end up being on a prescription drug even though you never went to see a doctor to get a prescription. You get small amounts of this in your water every day. So if I could like sum it up, if that's even possible, it is a concatenation of things that have come together, which some of what we see in society are the symptoms of a sick society rather than the causes of massive death by shooting in this country and by guns. So does that mean that guns should be banned in this country? Well, you can't actually do that. And of course, even if you could, it is not on the agenda of the people who make the decisions to have this happen. I think it was Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that said that if something happens in politics, it was meant to happen for a reason. There are no coincidences. And I think there are no coincidences in this regard as well. This country is flooded with guns because it is supposed to be flooded with guns. And gun violence is never addressed as a societal problem because of the power of the gun lobby and the corporate oligarchs behind them, which control the politicians and decide what is an acceptable bill or law or whatever is an acceptable time to talk about these issues and to have frank discussions about them. There are a lot of factors that are involved in how people come to engage in bloody acts of murder and terrible tragedy like we have in this school shooting in Newtown, Connecticut. But you can bet, and absolutely bet as much money as you want, that none of these issues are going to be solved unless people decide at some point to take a really hard look at how much we have been used in this country as test rabbits for the oligarchy. And the sad reality is that there's more of this to come in the future, because we've not yet reached the point of Greece and Spain and some of these other people, or some of these other countries around the world and their people, where they are engaged in massive street demonstrations, throwing Molotov cocktails and engaging in violence against the who? Yet again? The state. And in Greece, it is not anymore the state that is the problem than it is the state in this country. And yet you have the right-wing neoconfederates constantly talking about the evil federal government. And they foster in people the idea that their only defense is to, barricade their house and have massive amounts of guns and weapons and ammunition. And of course that goes into the idea of the preppers as well. And I wouldn't be surprised if corporations did not have a hand in the ideology of certain religious groups as well in promoting the idea of prepping and the stockpiling of weapons and ammunition like we see with the Seventh-day Adventists, because they have to keep promoting this idea. They have to keep ginning up fear in this country in order to keep selling guns, because that's, well, they want to fleece us dry of every penny that we have. So We are seeing a systematic terrorist act being conducted against the people of the United States by corporate oligarchy via the various avenues that they have to promote this. And the gun lobby in this country is largely controlled by the same faceless oligarchs that control everything else in every other avenue of our life. And we need to start facing the reality of what we actually have in this country and what the culture war is. And we need to realize that in the face of culture collapse and a bleak future and economic collapse and even the collapse of reality itself, go back and look at my Triumph of the Archons video if you want to see some of that in action, and you can see it around you every day. The very reality of our society is crumbling around us, and it's no wonder that people would fall off the edge. But the end result is what? You know, I don't know. I don't have an answer, but there certainly needs to be something done that would address some of the underlying causes here, the societal collapse, the economic collapse, a lot of these other things that we're faced with as scare-mongering tactics and fear-mongering by the government and the corporate oligarchs that are behind them. And we need to look at things from a rational, reasonable point of view and come to some understanding of why we are being manipulated in the way that we are and what are some of the possible solutions to this. And if we don't look at this wider societal picture, and if we don't look at who are the people that are making the decisions and why things are the way that they are, we are never going to come up with an answer to why we are mourning the death of 20 children and 7 adults. And we never will. We have to have these frank discussions, and we have to look at the wider picture in order to come up with any kind of solution that's ever going to make any sense. And that's just the facts. So I don't have any easy solutions for you, but I do encourage people to talk and to examine all of the various vectors that are being employed against the people of this country in order to stoke up this fear, in order to get these terrorist actions to happen against the people of this country and to promote it. And when you see the promotion of more and more gun sales by people like Alex Jones and the neoconfederate far-right people who are promoting the idea that the government is the worst enemy ever in the history of the world, when they don't even realize that the government that we have today is no longer a government that has any kind of real control. It is an oligarchy behind them. So let's have a frank discussion about this, but let's look at it in a much wider picture and try to come to some understanding of why we have come to the place that we have today. And perhaps we can solve the problem of why there are families that have been absolutely devastated by this terrible tragedy. Thank you. Good night.